Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining our webinar session today. I'm Hazel Langa, the Acting Director responsible for University Relations at UKZN. I am here to deliver the opening remarks on behalf of the Executive Director of Corporate Relations, Ms. Nomazolo. I would like to start by extending a very, very warm welcome to our esteemed panel, comprising of Advocate Dawn Coleman Malinga, Senior State Advocate based at the Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Unit of the NPA. Advocate Coleman Malinga will also facilitate the discussion. Thank you so much for that, Advocate Dawn. Welcome also to Ms. Lizelle Africa, Acting Head of the Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Unit, also from the NPA. A warm welcome also to our very own Professor Bohile Moletsani, Head of the J.L. Dube Research Chair in Rural Education, which is based in our School of Education. We also have Dr. Lubna Nadwee, an academic and a researcher in our School of Social Sciences. Dr. Nadwee is also a member of board of the Durban-based Advice Desk for the Abused. Greetings also to all our colleagues, students, our alumni, members of the media. I welcome you all to the final webinar series for 2021, which is hosted by the University of KwaZulu-Natal in partnership with the National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa. Our webinar is aptly themed, Stop Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. This is an important call to action. Why did we choose this topic? Well, recent estimates published by the World Health Organization indicates that globally, about 1 in 3 of women worldwide, that's 30% of women worldwide, have been subjected to either physical or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. That is high. If you bring this closer to home and look at the crime statistics presented by our Minister of Police last week, looking at the period between July and September 2021, sexual offenses in general went up by 4.7%, while rape went up by 7.1%. This is during a very, very short period of about 3 months, as I said, between July to September. Around that period, over 9,500 rape cases were reported. This is alarming and deeply, deeply disturbing. The other disturbing part also is that educational institutions such as ours in South Africa are not spared from the scourge of GBVF. For example, at the end of July in 2020, a former colleague, a lady who worked with us here at UKZN, and a dear friend of mine who worked at the University of Zululand, she was brutally murdered by her husband, who later committed suicide. They were buried on the 9th of August in 2020. Some of our students have reported cases of sexual harassment taking place on or off our campuses. This challenge is real. However, it is reassuring and encouraging to know that our caring institution takes matters of GBVF seriously. The university's commitment to addressing this challenge is evident if you look at the GBVF strategy, which aims to provide an integrated, coherent strategic policy and programming framework to strengthen a coordinated institutional response to the crisis of GBVF. This strategy reflects the institutional commitment to a centralized management structure with key operational mechanisms in place at every campus to effectively and urgently respond to arising needs. I encourage staff and students to visit the university intranet to read more on these documents that have been prepared by the GBVF committee. There was a call asking people to participate in a research that was done by the committee, which will also feed into the strategy. So I hope we all participated. As a university, we are also grateful to the KZN Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Unit of the National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa for partnering with us in addressing many social ills affecting the university community and the community at large. This has been done through various webinar sessions. As I've said, this is the last one for this year, but this is not the end because these problems are with us daily. So we will continue next year again. So please be on the lookout for more information on other upcoming topics in 2022. Today, I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panel about the legal tools available to protect ourselves and loved ones against GBVF, the role of activism in fighting the scourge, and also how far are we in the implementation of the National Strategic Plan on GBVF since its introduction in 2020. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to Advocate Coleman Malinga, who will facilitate the discussion as I explained when we started. Advocate Coleman Malinga holds the position of a senior advocate and is based at the Director of Public Prosecution's Office in Pietermaritzburg. She chairs the Human Trafficking, Harmful Traditional Practices, Prostitution, Pornography and Brothels Task Team in KZN. She is a member of the National Intersectoral Trafficking in Persons Task Team. She also chairs the Rapid Response Team for Trafficking in Persons in KZN. She is also a member of the training team for the NPA and has been actively involved in the training of prosecutors on many areas, including trafficking in persons for a number of years. So we are in good hands. Advocate Coleman Malinga, over to you, sis. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Mrs. Langa. It is much appreciated. We value our partnership as the Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Unit with the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And, our aim in hosting these webinars is to improve the safety and security of the UKZN community and to create awareness around gender-based violence. And since we now are on the countdown towards the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, that kicks off on the 25th of November and runs to the 10th of December, it is really appropriate that we are hosting this webinar that focuses specifically on the legal aspects when you're applying for a protection order, also looking at girls and young women's activism in the fight against gender-based violence and the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence. So thank you very much for hosting this webinar. As we head towards the 16 days of activism, noting that the global theme for this year is Orange the World, End Violence Against Women Now. I'd also like to encourage all of our colleagues that are out there, good afternoon to you, to engage with us. We've got experts on the panel this afternoon. Please do record all your questions in the question and answer tab under the chat, and we will address all of these questions once all the presentations have been completed. It is a wonderful opportunity to engage with us and get more information around this topic. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, who I'm very honored and privileged to introduce this afternoon. She is a colleague of mine and has been for many years. It's Advocate Lizelle Africa. She is the acting head of the Sexual Offences and Community Affairs Unit, which we call SOCA for short, within the National Prosecuting Authority. She's the acting head, and her primary role focuses on the issues involving the victimization of women and children. Her responsibilities include the implementation and delivery of the unit's mandate, which is the development of strategy and policy relating to sexual offences, to domestic violence, human trafficking, maintenance matters, and young offenders, while supporting the work of the prosecution. The broad outcomes that the SOCI unit seek to achieve are to improve the conviction rate in gender-based violence crimes and crimes against children, to actively protect vulnerable groups from abuse and violence, to ensure access to maintenance support, and to systematically reduce secondary victimization. So Advocate Africa is an employee of the NPA for over 20 years and has prosecuted sexual offences for 11 of those years. She's also a member of the National Sexual Offences Task Team for the last 9 years, and this team is responsible for the development and review of training material, as well as for training all prosecutors dealing with sexual offences. Just to mention, Advocate Africa has also assisted in the establishment of a number of Tutuzela care centres in the Western Cape, and is responsible for the provincial oversight of these centres. So welcome, Advocate Africa. Welcome. We really are grateful to have you here this afternoon, and she will be presenting on the legal aspects when applying for a protection order. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I really appreciate the introduction, and thank you so much for to all of the panelists. I believe I'm in very good company this afternoon, and also to the organizers for including me in this session this afternoon. As Dawn indicated, I will be speaking on domestic violence this afternoon, specifically the legal aspects pertaining to domestic violence. I just want to put up my screen, if I can just get an indication that it is showing. Yeah. All right. So when we discuss domestic violence, we do need to understand that domestic violence is a very, very broad term. And whilst there is a specific legislation, a specific act that governs the domestic violence in South Africa, we do not have specific offences under the Domestic Violence Act. We have a few, which I will mention a bit later, but we do not have specific acts that can be perpetrated on a particular complainant that is part of the domestic violence legislation. I'm going to contextualize that in a moment, but I just thought it prudent for us to understand that from the outset, so that when we have a look at the information that I will be sharing, you can understand, when we talk about a murder or an assault or a rape in a domestic violence circumstance, it's not necessarily covered under the domestic violence legislation. So my first slide that I have on the screen for all of us is just a broad outline of the domestic violence legislation. And this domestic violence legislation is the Domestic Violence Act 116 of 1998, and it has gone through a few amendments over the years since its inception. And if you have a look at the various sections and what it covers, you'll see that it's quite wide and broad in terms of the issues that it covers under this piece of legislation. We unfortunately won't be able to go into all of the aspects pertaining to the legislation. I've just selected a few aspects that I felt prudent for us to share in the limited time that we have available, but I've included the outline of the legislation just for your information purposes. So in order to start, the afternoon's discussion, we need to know that the legislation came into operation on the 15th of December 1999. And we need to have an understanding of exactly what is domestic violence in terms of this legislation and what is it defined as. And if we look at the wording, it says that it's an ongoing pattern. So it's not just a once-off, it's not just a twice, but there must be an ongoing pattern of coercive control that is repetitive, or it increases in severity over time and may be in various forms. And we're going to discuss these various forms as we continue with the information sharing. And examples of some of the various forms that we may find in terms of domestic violence would be your physical, emotional, or psychological, sexual, economic abuse, and there are other forms as well, which we'll also have a look at. Now, if we talk about abuse, and sometimes we use the terms of domestic violence and abuse synonymously, but they actually mean very, very different things. And we do find that abuse falls under domestic violence, but abuse can also be dealt with on its own. And it's important for us to understand the difference between what we term as abuse generically, and then also what we cover or what we understand as domestic violence. So abuse is slightly different from domestic violence. Here we also have a pattern of coercive, controlling or abusive behavior, but it's not necessarily an ongoing situation. So if we look a bit closer at abuse, it can also occur in a domestic relationship, but here in this particular circumstance, it causes harm, or there are threats of harm that can be caused either to the complainant, in terms of their health or their well-being, or to family of the complainant as well. And the aim of this particular abuse is to dominate the other person or to force them to submit to that particular person's will. So that would then just be in terms of having an understanding of domestic violence and also abuse, if you talk about abuse generically. Then for purposes of our discussion, we're going to be referring to the complainant throughout this information sharing. And a complainant, for the purposes of the Domestic Violence Act, is someone who is or has been in a domestic relationship with the respondent. The respondent in turn would be the perpetrator, the person that has committed the act of domestic violence in terms of the domestic violence legislation. And it is important to understand that this complainant can be anyone in this domestic violence relationship. It can be an adult person, it can be a child, or it can be a child in the care of the person that is being abused as well. So just to keep that in mind, because we're going to be referring to the complainant throughout. When we look at the domestic relationship, it is important for us to understand who is covered under the domestic violence legislation. Is it just two people, walking down the street and, they do not know each other, and then one person comes up to the other and then just smacks the person? Is that it? Is that, for argument's sake, two people in a domestic relationship? So once again, we have domestic relationship defined in the legislation, which makes it easier for us to have an understanding of who is considered, as being part of the domestic relationship. And part of the domestic relationship in terms of the legislation is it caters for persons who were married to each other, including, persons who are married either, according to custom or religion, or they are married in terms of South African law. We also have persons who were previously married to each other or who are divorced. Then we also have persons who are in a relationship with each other, and this goes for heterosexual relationships as well as same-sex relationships. And they can either be living together or they were living together previously. Doesn't matter that they are not married or that they cannot marry each other, or that they are not in any form of other type of marriage relationship, but that they are just living together would suffice. Then we also, the legislation also under domestic relationship caters for parents of children, or persons who have or has had responsibility for that child, or maybe has had parental rights for that child. It doesn't matter that it's not at the same time. Then also specific family members. So yeah, you would think of your siblings, grandparents living in the home, aunts and uncles, when you have your sort of nuclear households. And then also whether they were engaged, dating, or in a custom relationship, or whether they lived together as man and wife, or whether they recently shared a residence together, or are still currently sharing a residence together. So that is a very broad and wide scope of a domestic relationship. So when we have a domestic violence circumstance, we have to first determine, was there a domestic relationship between the two parties before we can actually look at utilizing the remedies in the domestic violence legislation. So now we're going to have a look at what are the forms of domestic violence. And the forms of domestic violence is described in section 1. And it looks at very specific forms. So the first one we'll start with is the one which refers to physical abuse. And I think most of us would have some knowledge of what physical abuse means. So it would speak to physical assault. And this would be any physical force against the complainant. You know, it can be a slap, it can be a shove, it can be a kick. You know, it can even escalate to even more serious forms of physical force. Forcibly confining or detaining the complainant, so keeping hold of the complainant, not wanting them to leave, locking them up in a room. Physically depriving the complainant of access to food, water, clothing, shelter, or rest. So as part of the dominance or control that is being exerted over the complainant, you know, you would maybe keep them away from food. You wouldn't grant them any access to something to drink, water. You know, you take their clothing away so they can't leave the house. You know, maybe let them walk around naked or in their underwear in the home. So this would then be a form of a physical abuse. Sexual abuse is also something that one, you know, we may also be more afraid with. And this includes forcing the complainant to engage in any sexual contact or sexual conduct. It also speaks to sexual conduct that either abuses, humiliates, degrades, or otherwise compromises the sexual integrity of that particular complainant. And this would be the same for children as well. Or exposing the complainant to sexual material, which humiliates, degrades, so either pornography, you know, or other types of sexual material. You know, you can think of your sex toys or anything like that, but it's done with the intent, you know, to violate or compromise that complainant's sexual integrity. And then it would also extend to the same conduct or contact with another person with whom the complainant has emotional ties. So maybe it's a family member that's living in the house, but in order to exert control over that particular complainant, you would then show the material to them, the sexual material, you know, or do things to them in order to get the complainant also to comply to your wishes or to submit as the perpetrator. Then we would also, another form would be emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse. This is also a very, very common form of abuse. And very often, you know, if there's no physical violence attached to this type of abuse, or sexual violence attached to this type of abuse, then women are more often than not even aware that they are in a domestic violence circumstance, and therefore they would not be reporting. And sometimes, you know, there are other people that are aware of this type of abuse, and they you know, they wouldn't share that with the complainant or alert the complainant. But look, you don't have to actually be in this type of relationship, because this is actually a form of domestic violence. So let's just have a look at what is covered under emotional, verbal, and psychological abuse. It would be a pattern of degrading or humiliating conduct. So anything that would seek to degrade or humiliate you as a person. And it can either be directly towards the complainant, or it can be, once again, towards a family member or a dependent. So if the perpetrator is a boyfriend living with the complainant, who is the girlfriend, and they have a child, so in order to you know, exert some form of control over that particular complainant, you would constantly degrade the child. Oh, this child is good for nothing. Oh, I can see, you know, why the father left and doesn't want to look after the child, you know. So it's repeated insults, it's ridiculing or name calling. This can either be directly to that complainant, or it can be to the child, causing emotional pain, you know, maybe flirting with somebody else in front of the complainant, making the complainant feel like she's not worth anything, you know, that she must be grateful for the little bits of affection, or, you know, just consideration that that particular perpetrator would give the complainant. And then also where there are repeated exhibitions of obsessive possessiveness or jealousy. So it's not normal jealousy, you know, it's that this excessive, you can't go anywhere. Why were you talking to that person? What are you saying to that person? Depriving them from actually going out and spending time with friends, or following them to work and ensuring that they only go to work and come home immediately, or maybe even at times not wanting them to go to work. But you're basically being deprived of your privacy, your liberty, or your integrity, or your security as a complainant. And then we also have economic abuse, and this is also very occurs very often in a lot of relationships, where there is the unreasonable deprivation of any economic or financial resources. And this is obviously where the complainant is dependent on those resources, and which he or she is entitled to under law. But the person is being deprived of that because it's another way of exhibiting control over that person. Unreasonable disposing of immovable or movable property without the complainant being a party to that. So maybe just disposing of the vehicle so that she can't move around with ease, maybe going to work or whatever, so the car is then removed, destroying, damaging, hiding, hindering, any use of property in which that is in the complainant's control that belongs to the complainant, or that the complainant has an interest or a reasonable expectation to use. So there are various sort of forms of economic abuse, and if it falls within any of those categories, then it would be fall within under the domestic violence circumstance. Then we also have intimidation. This would be intentionally inducing or causing fear to a complainant, a family member, or a dependent, and it can happen in a number of ways, either by committing physical abuse. It can be by threatening physical abuse. It can be by exhibiting a weapon to that particular person. It can be any weapon, even if it's just picking up a brick and using that to intimidate the complainant. Any other menacing behavior, either sending, delivering, or causing to be delivered any items which implies menacing behavior. So, notes which says, if you don't do this, I'll get you, whatever, and then also where the person enters the residence or property of the complainant without the complainant's consent. And this is specifically where the persons do not share a residence together. Then harassment. This is also fairly common. And this is where the person repeatedly follows, pursues, or accosts the complainant or a family member. This can be done in various forms as well. And this is all unwelcome either communications or attention. And it can either be by watching or loitering outside or near the building. It can be repeatedly making telephone calls to the complainant or to third persons, talking about the complainant and, saying various things about them, or repeatedly sending or delivering or causing the delivery of letters, telegrams, packages, faxes, whatever form of communication that particular perpetrator may use. And this is all, once again, in an effort to exhibit control over that particular complainant. Then we have other forms which I've not expounded on because they are self-explanatory, but it's also other forms that are being covered under the domestic violence circumstance in the terms of the domestic violence legislation. So it's important for us to also understand who can apply for a protection order. And according to the legislation, there are certain people that can apply. So it will either be yourself if you are the complainant, which is the primary direct victim or the complainant. And then also if there's an indirect victim, so where the child is in the care of the direct victim and that child is suffering in a domestic violence circumstance, then you as the complainant can, or the child's parent can then apply on behalf of that particular child. Any minors without assistance can apply. So if you're not getting help at home as a child, and a minor would be somebody under the age of 18 years of age, they can go to court and they can get a protection order. And then any person on behalf of a minor can also apply. And this is very important because very often we are aware of children that are in an abusive relationship or in a domestic violence relationship or in a domestic violence circumstance, and we don't provide assistance, or we don't try to assist that particular child. So when it comes to minors, we can also apply on behalf of a minor. Then also, very importantly, any person who has a material interest in the well-being of the victim. So whether it's an adult person or a child, if you're seeing a counselor and the counselor can see, but you are not able to apply for the protection order on your own, and it is important to get this particular complainant assistance, then you as the counsellor, once you've received or obtained the written consent from the complainant, you can actually make an application for a protection order on behalf of that particular complainant. Same with a healthcare worker. If you're reporting at a healthcare facility and you're reporting with an assault, and the history is then shared that it comes to that the assault or the abuse is as a result of a domestic violence circumstance, then that healthcare worker can also assist. If the complainant is too afraid to make an application for protection order, they can also then do that once they have the written consent. Likewise, police, social worker, teacher, employer, family member, basically any of those persons or parties can apply with the written consent of the complainant. What we also need to understand is that when it comes to the application for a protection order, that is a civil process, and this is something where the complainant has to go to court and make an application at the court. And they will, I'll explain in a moment, the types of assistance you get at the court and the process that needs to follow. But that whole process of an application is a civil process. We also have another option, which is the option of laying a criminal charge. And this is very helpful as a remedy, specifically where there has been a physical assault. Remember at the beginning when I started, I mentioned that there aren't specific offences under the domestic violence legislation, but there are other offences that can occur in a domestic violence circumstance, and those are your assaults, your assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm. So this is your fisting, your hitting with an object, attempted murder, your rape, or any sexual offense that occurs within a domestic violence circumstance, murder, those are all things that can occur in a domestic violence circumstance as well. So specifically, all the other offenses that I've listed besides the murder, the complainant can lay a criminal charge against the perpetrator, who will then be accused in the criminal court for any of those domestic violence related offences that I've just mentioned. It can even be malicious damage to property. Remember, I said one of the forms of domestic violence could be damage to property, and the offence would then be malicious damage to property. The third option could be that you apply simultaneously, or that you use both of the remedies simultaneously. So you can apply for a protection order, but you can also lay a charge at the police station, especially where an offence was committed, because then that will be a criminal offence, and then you simultaneously apply for a protection order as well, in order to ensure that the perpetrator does not come close to your residence, cannot make any contact with you, whatever the conditions are that are set in that particular protection order. Or you can do one after the other. That would obviously be your prerogative as the complainant in that particular matter. But just for us to all understand that these are the remedies that are available to complainants in a domestic violence circumstance. So how do we apply for a protection order? So because it's a civil process, it's very procedural in terms of how this can take place. So before we can do anything, in terms of making an application, you must go to the magistrate's court in your jurisdiction in order to be able to apply for a protection order. There are specific application forms for a protection order that must be filled out, and it can be filled out in the language of your choice. The Department of Justice, as the custodians of the courts, are responsible for ensuring that those forms are available. When you fill out the application form, there are very specific questions, obviously your personal details, but also you have to detail specifically what form of domestic violence or what it is that you are complaining of in that particular application form, so that the magistrate has an understanding of what type of domestic violence has occurred and on what basis they need to grant the protection order. If you have supporting affidavits, maybe people that witnessed the abuse, or the emotional abuse that took place, or if you have affidavits of the damage to property and the insurance claims, all of those, and you have all of that information, those will all be submitted as part of your supporting affidavits. More often than not, you will have a clerk of the court, somebody that works at the courts, that works for the Department of Justice, and they will assist you with completing those the application form and including the supporting affidavits. And that clerk of the court will then have to take that application form to the magistrate. Magistrate will have a look at it. You will go into the magistrate's office or into the court, and the magistrate will then consider and make a decision in terms of whether that protection order will be granted or not. What we do need to understand is that more often than not, when we do apply for a protection order, very often the perpetrator, the respondent, because he has to respond to that application, is not at court at the same time. And very often those protection orders that we are seeking, it's almost an urgent situation. So the legislation has made provision for an interim protection order, because the final protection order cannot be granted unless the respondent has been given an opportunity to come and answer and to be able to say why the order should not be made final. So in circumstances where, there may be potential harm, or the complainant might feel threatened, that more harm will occur if she does not, or he does not obtain a protection order, the magistrate may make an order which is interim, which is called an interim protection order. And this will be then granted without the respondent being there, without the abuser physically being at court, to be able to answer to that particular application. And what will also then happen is that the complainant will be given a date when she or he has to come back to court to be able to speak in support of the final protection order being granted. The paperwork will then be given back to the clerk of the court. The paperwork must then be served on the respondent, informing them of the return date for the final protection order. And that will then be given to the police, and the police will go and serve those papers, or it can be the sheriff of the court that will serve those papers on the respondent. And once that date has been given and there is proof of service, on the date when the complainant does come back to court and the perpetrator or the respondent decides not to come to court, but there's been proper service, then the court can go ahead and proceed to make that order final. Once that order is made final, then the protection order will be enforced and it will not lapse unless the court sets that particular order aside. The difference with the interim protection order, however, is that it's only for a limited period, and it's only until the return date for when you have to come in provide information for the final protection order. So once that date has been given and that date has come and gone and neither parties have come to court, then that interim protection order will no longer be valid. What can also happen is that there can be specific conditions that the magistrate can also include as part of the interim protection order. And if any of those conditions have been breached, or if any of those conditions have been contravened, then the complainant will have to then also seek recourse for that. And like I said earlier, the complainant must return on the return date to court, otherwise that protection order will not be made final. So when we have a look at the violation of a protection order, as I indicated, if there are certain conditions in the protection order, like you cannot go to the residence of the complainant, you cannot have any contact with the complainant, cannot go to the home of the complainant. If any of those conditions are breached or have contact with any of the family members, then that complainant can go to the nearest police station, make an affidavit and a statement to say, but I have a protection order, it has been made final, the accused person or the perpetrator or the respondent in the matter has come to my place of residence or come to my place of work. He does not want to stop, speaking to my family members and, harassing me. And once you've made that statement, we'll then have to go to court and then submit that copy and everything to the court, and the court will then issue a warrant of arrest for that perpetrator. And that person will then be in default or in contravention of that particular protection order. And that will then be a criminal offense, which we can also then take to court, and the accused will then have to come and answer as to why he breached the terms of that particular protection order. So once that warrant of arrest has been issued, the police can go and have that particular person arrested. So that in a nutshell is the whole process of the protection, of applying for the protection order, of information that you would need to provide as part of the protection order, specifically who the complainant is, who is covered under the domestic violence relationship, what the various types and forms of domestic violence would be. And also, you know, the fact that we do not have specific offenses. The only offense that we do have is the contravention of a protection order, or the default, you know, the respondent defaulting on a protection order, which would then become a criminal offense. But all other criminal offenses that I've mentioned, if it occurs in a domestic violence circumstance, then you could either apply for the protection order and go and make a case at the police station, and then that will then become a criminal case that the accused person will have to answer for as well. So that in a nutshell are some of the legal aspects pertaining to the application for a protection order. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very informative presentation, Advocate Africa. That was, I think, an eye-opener for most people. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and expertise in this field. We very greatly appreciate it. I do see some questions coming through, which we will attend to at the end. I'm going to just move forward and introduce our second speaker, Professor Bohile Moletsani. Is a professor and the J.L. Dubie Chair in Rural Education in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She is co-PR with Claudia Mitchell of the Networks for Change and Wellbeing, girl-led from the ground up, approaches to addressing sexual violence in Canada and South Africa. She is co-editor of the 2021 book titled Ethical Practice in Participatory Visual Research with Girls, New York, Oxford. It's from Bergen Books, and she's going to be addressing us this afternoon on girls and young women's activism in the fight against gender-based violence. So I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much, Professor Moletsani, for taking time out to be with us this afternoon. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Advocate Dawn. And also thank you, Advocate Africa, for that very grounding and useful input, which we have all benefited from and will benefit from going forward. Now that we know what the law says and what our legal recourse is, I wanted to us to look at a different part of our society, which is the victims themselves. We know that most of the social ills that we are talking about today are negatively skewed against girls and young women. And hence we are talking today about what are the strategies that we might engage to address this situation. However, today I want us to look at the girls and young women themselves and their role in activism in the fight against this gender-based violence and even femicide itself. So why a focus on girls and young women's activism? While we acknowledge that indeed they are victims of gender-based violence, but also other social ills such as HIV and AIDS, unplanned and unwanted pregnancies, to count a few. We also know that there is this enduring discourse of girls and women as victims. And today I'm inviting us to think about ways that we might challenge this enduring discourse. Indeed, unequal gender norms mean that this group are often silenced, and that activism, their activism, is often met with disapproval. They are being un-African, they are being unladylike, and even violence sometimes. And their voices are often ignored as a result. So the previous speaker I think alluded, and the previous two speakers alluded to just how much girls and young women and women generally. And there are various intersectionalities or intersecting factors that impact negatively among them. The first area of study published by Koresha Abdul Karim and Baxter in 2016, they highlighted how young women, girls and young women really between the ages of 15 and 24, who has the least power in society, bear an enormous burden of both intimate partner violence and HIV. And they link that to poverty as a result. So for example, young women between these ages of 15 have up to 6 times more HIV infection. And highlighting also that men and women who have experienced gender-based violence are more than likely to have behaviors that increase HIV infection. So a very clear link between poverty, HIV, and gender-based violence. Recently, in the past 2 or 3 weeks, we have heard about the increase in gender-based violence cases from the South African Police Services report. Almost 10,000 just between July and September 2021. We know for a fact that there's high underreporting in the country, so the cases are likely to be higher than that. A few weeks ago also, we had the outcry about the so-called teenage pregnancy, particularly that among these pregnancies was a very high increase of pregnancies among children aged 9 to 14. And what struck me as odd was the way it was being talked about, as if these children, as if it is normal for children this age to have, to be pregnant and to be made pregnant, and not talking about the perpetrators of the rape against these children. So again, the links between teenage pregnancy or child pregnancy and gender-based violence being under talked about and being under addressed.
Sorry, Professor Moletsani, to interrupt you.
Yes.
The slideshow is not moving and it's not on slideshow. So I'm just bringing that to your attention.
Okay. Is it working now?
No, it's still.
Is it working?
No, it's not working yet.
Okay, I'll stop sharing for a minute and then start again. Can you see it now?
Yes, there we go. Thank you so much.
Okay. So anyway, the previous slide was just showing what we already had from the SAPS and DBE in the past few weeks. But also we know that COVID has indeed reversed the little gains that we had made in terms of gender equality and in terms of addressing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. While there's little research on the gender impact of COVID-19, we have also had harrowing evidence about gender-based violence in our own country, but also internationally, including early marriages, a dramatic surge in child marriages and adolescent pregnancies across the world. And so, as I said, the pandemic has indeed reversed the little progress that we had made. So knowing all of that, what we also know from our work is that girls and young women are engaged in various forms of resistance and activism to address these social issues that impact their lives. However, having said that, we know that girl-led activism can be dangerous for the girls themselves, particularly in contexts that are characterized by gender-based violence and where girls are usually not allowed to speak. So we know that such activism is likely to occur with the support of adult activists who have access to resources, but who also have skills and authority that give them access to decision makers in government, decision makers in communities and schools. So we know that it occurs, but it needs the support of adults. We also know emerging research that suggests that girls are not only victims, but that they also have resilience and have learned over the years some survival skills. So what I'm asking, backed by this research, is that rather than reinforcing perceptions of girls as only vulnerable and only victims, how about we think about strategies that empower and support them to act in the communities where they are and in the schools where they are. Doing that, working with girls as knowers and actors implies acknowledging that the centrality of their lived experience might help us to develop sustainable solutions to the barriers to their safety and well-being in these spaces. So how do we challenge the enduring girls as victims discourse? We know that there are very few stories of girls activists across the globe. We hear a few stories about girl bloggers and online activists, I guess because that's relatively a safe way to be active. But we also have been reading a lot about international girl activists, starting with Malala Yousafzai, who was from Pakistan and is now living in the UK. Currently, Greta Thunberg is dominating. Emma Gonzalez with gun violence in the USA. Nyombi Morris in Uganda. Lesein Mutunge from Kenya. So internationally, girls have been activists. In South Africa, starting with during apartheid, we have read about guerrilla girls, and in contemporary times with the end rape culture movement, lots of girls participating there. To name a few, we have Amanda Nomnga, who's the founder of the She Is Brave Foundation. We also know of Zuleika Patel. There are many others that I can mention. So there are girl activists across the world and in our country. I just want to spend a few minutes to illustrate how this can be done. In our project that Dawn introduced, which had those three aims, we aim to understand how girls and young women from rural communities experience violence. We also aim to engage with stakeholders and community and institutions in dialogue and to promote policy-relevant dialogue to end gender-based violence in these communities. We worked with groups of girls in and to communities in various activities, including analyzing the issues that they encounter, identifying and developing strategies for addressing them, and channeling as adult researchers, channeling their agency and taking action. As I said, girls' activism necessarily requires the assistance of adult support because of the power relations in the communities and in the institutions. But what needs to happen even then is centering girls' voices. And so this is what we did in this particular community. The girls, one of the strategies that the girls identified was to hold an awareness march about gender-based violence in this community. And as we heard from them and their parents and the community, it was the first march of that kind in this community. Our own UKZN reported on this event back in 2017, highlighting who came, who participated, and what the girls achieved on that day. So if you see there, after the march, we went back to the hall where the girls themselves presented to the community the issues that they were complaining about and the solutions that they were suggesting. And there is the community dialogue afterwards. And during this community dialogue, the girls also invited the community responses to what they had presented and chatted with the community the interventions that are needed in this community. So that's in brief an example of how this work can be done in communities with groups of girls and young women, or with women more generally. So what difference does this make? Girls' activism and girls' voices as knowers and actors are key, I have argued, to informing sustainable from the ground up interventions and policy making. Secondly, what I was trying to illustrate is that the aim of the march was not only to raise awareness about the issues, but it was also to start community dialogue that would lead to identifying and developing solutions to, as one of the posters at the march read, "Stop the war on women's bodies." Thirdly, speaking against gender-based violence in front of adult community members, as the girls in this group did, at least for this one day, the girls participated in a sort of a here too, meaning that here too gender-based violence happens, and thereby contributing to the larger Me Too movement, if you like, and breaking the silence. Fourth, this girl-led march illustrates the significance of girls' activism and just how important it is in terms of informing the community about the issues, but also informing potential sustainable interventions for addressing the social ills that the girls experience. Again, I want to end with the caution that while I said at the beginning that this kind of activism by girls requires input and support from adults, we also have experienced in our project that adult facilitated activism can be messy because of the power dynamics. and can potentially be dangerous for the girls involved, especially in gender unequal and violent sessions. As we walked away from this march, for example, we wondered on our way back to Durban whether any of the girls who participated would experience censure or even violence from their boyfriends, from their fathers, from their family members, or from community members. Fortunately, nothing of that sort happened. And so my call today is, let's look at listening to girls' voices. Let's look at opening spaces for girls and young women themselves to voice their experiences and their desires for change in communities and institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Moletsani, for that presentation. It certainly is food for thought on how we can, take this issue of gender-based violence forward. I see some questions coming up as well, which we'll keep to the end. I'm going to present our third panelist for today, Dr. Lubna Nadwee. She is an academic and researcher based in the School of Social Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and lectures in undergraduate studies and supervises postgraduate students in the disciplines of political sciences, international relations, and conflict transformation and peace studies. She has published in various academic journals. She's got a very impressive CV, edited book collections. She's co-edited a book, contributed articles for various popular publications. She's published a collection of poetry in addition to all of that. So Dr. Nadwee is a community activist and a freelance journalist. In her spare time, she serves on the board of the Advice Desk for the Abused, where she's been the deputy chair from 2007 to 2011, and then the chair from 2011 to 2013. As a gender activist, she's also a member of various community-based organizations, such as Women in Action South Africa and the South African Council of Muslim Women. She's also an activist within the international and national Palestinian solidarity movement. Dr. Nadwee has a BA Honours from the University of Durban Westville and an MA from Coventry University, UK, and a PhD from UKZN. So Dr. Nadwee will be doing an assessment of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence this afternoon. Thank you very much. Welcome, Dr. Nadwee, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Advocate Coleman, for that introduction. And thank you very much to UKZN for inviting me to participate in this webinar. So let me just share my PowerPoint and I can then proceed. I hope that everyone is able to see that and I hope that I can actually get it to be enlarged. So the previous speakers have actually focused on the issue of the legal framework and, of course, the activist aspects of addressing gender-based violence. And so my presentation will focus on looking at sort of more government-led initiatives as well as civil society-led initiatives more broadly, and focusing on this initiative called the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. So I want to start off by basically focusing on looking at the broader gender machinery that we have in South Africa, just to put some perspective on what are the sort of tools that are available to us in South Africa to address and respond to gender-based violence and femicide. So we have what is sort of known as the Ministry and Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities. There's been some, of course, criticism of that whole sort of, putting all of these various groupings and demographic groups together in one ministry. That's a different debate. We then have the Commission for Gender Equality, which of course was set up as a sort of structure to ensure monitoring of gender work and gender activities. And then, of course, there's a lot of national legislation that has been sort of created, and our first speaker spoke to the Domestic Violence Act, for example. There's the Children's Act, the Sexual Offences Related Matters Act, Child Justice Act, Protection from Harassment Act, and so on. And then, of course, the government set up what was called the Tutuzela Care Centres to respond to the issue of helping victims, particularly victims of sexual offences and rape, where they could get, immediate care and, be able to be assisted moving forward. And of course, then you have your various civil society structures and NGOs and CBOs that work in the area of gender-based violence and femicide. And these are very often the sort of core structures that help, our women and girls and sort of, just society generally to deal with the incidences and sort of experiences of sexual violence that many go through. So I want to now move into looking at providing some context, the background and context to the National Strategic Plan. Now, in August 2018, a woman from across South Africa participated in what was called the total shutdown, the national total shutdown marches. And these were protesting against spiraling levels of gender-based violence and femicide in the country. So just to provide some context, I listed all of the gender machinery that we have in this country, the legislation and the frameworks. But despite that, we have incredibly high levels of incidences of gender-based violence and femicide. And in 2018, women came together and they said, enough, we are marching, we're protesting, and it's going to be a national, initiative. And subsequent to that, a delegation of these women who marched camped outside, literally outside the Union buildings in Pretoria to meet our President Ramaphosa, and actually didn't leave until he met with them. And kudos to them for that. And of course, this meeting with the president then ultimately led to the first presidential summit on gender-based violence and femicide, which was held in November 2018. Now, this is just a poster that was advertising all of the marches. You can see that it happened virtually across the entire country. Now, it's important to understand, and what I'm going to do actually is to run through the process of how the National Strategic Plan came to be as a consequence of the presidential summit. And so the presidential summit concluded with the signing of the declaration that government, business, labor, and civil society would collaborate to conceptualize, drive, and implement concrete measures to eradicate gender-based violence and femicide. And the parties to the declaration called for a multi-sectoral structure, and it's a very important term, multi-sectoral structure to be constituted to coordinate the implementation of this National Strategic Plan on GBVF. And then there was an interim steering committee that was established, or that, this declaration also made provision for that, to establish this interim steering committee to lead the process of establishing various structures, developing programs, and mobilizing resources. So the interim steering committee was established in April 2019, just to give you a timeline, and I'll be sort of using some dates to give you an idea of when it all started and how, where we are right now. And this steering committee was established under the leadership of Advocate Brenda Madumise Pajibo and Dr. Alok Shisana. Subsequent to that, an emergency response action plan was sort of put together to address this issue of GBVF. It was developed and presented to Parliament, where it was approved during a special joint sitting in September of 2019. Now, it's of course important that funds be made available. So a budget was sort of sourced through budgetary reprioritization in sort of the government sector, and in order to achieve the following. And this was firstly to urgently respond to victims and survivors of GBV, broadening access to justice for survivors, changing social norms and behavior through high-level awareness raising and prevention campaigns, strengthening existing architecture and promoting accountability, and the creation of more economic opportunities for women who are vulnerable to abuse because of poverty. And of course, this NSP was then developed and produced by the Interim Steering Committee and published in April 2020. Now, according to the president, who reflects on this, the NSP, it's actually a document. It's actually, according to the president, a government and civil society's multi-sectoral strategic framework to realize a South Africa free from gender-based violence and femicide. It recognizes all violence against women across age, location, disability, sexual orientation, sexual and gender identity, nationality, and other diversities, as well as violence against children. The NSP is premised on the equality of all gender groupings, including the LGBTQI community, and affirms that accessing services is human rights based. Now, I put that up so that you get a sense of this is what the head of our country, the leader, is saying, that he as head of government is recognizing all of these aspects. So it's important that we note that. Now, the NSP is made up of 6 pillars or areas that it intends to focus on, or work needs to be done in these areas. And these are 1, accountability, coordination, and leadership; 2, prevention and rebuilding social cohesion; 3, justice, safety, and protection; 4, response, care, support, and healing; 5, economic power; 6, research and information systems. And of course, the sort of the document that was produced, since it was produced, there's been these various developments that have happened. The following institution architecture has been put into place. 1, the Interministerial Committee on GBVF has been established in June 2020 to provide political oversight to the establishment of the Council and the National GBVF agenda overall. And secondly, GBVF Implementation Collaborative has developed as a multi-sectoral pillar-based virtual platform to take specific elements of the NSP on GBVF forward. And of course, a process was led by President Ramaphosa to set up a fund. So this fund was set up in February of 2021, and its first meeting was held in August 2021. And it's important to make this point because, of course, the implementation of this NSP cannot actually function without these sort of financial funds being made available. Now, one thing I want to speak about, and this speaks to this issue of assessing the NSP. In early 2021, there was some confusion in the broader GBVF civil society sector, and even within government, about why the Council on GBVF had not yet been set up, because it was originally envisioned to have been set up by April 2020. And it emerged that a regulatory framework or legislative framework for the establishment of the council still had to be finalized. So this was reported on in the media, and there were some concerns around it. Now, this framework was basically that a bill had to actually be, passed. So this framework was what was called the National Council on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Bill. Okay, and the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability was tasked with developing the bill. It has been approved by Cabinet in September of this year and gazetted in October of this year for public consultations. And the public consultations are currently ongoing. And the most recent one, which I attended, was the 5th consultation held in KZN, and it was a KZN consultative meeting held last week on the 19th of November. Together with that, earlier this year, a year 1 progress report on the NSP covering the period of May 2020 to April 2021 was released earlier in this year. And the report made some of the following observations, and I wanted to go through it because this is basically, the people who have been implementing the NSP, even though the council has not really been set up, but putting in place some of the framework or the sort of machinery in order to implement the NSP. And it's important to note what they've been saying, okay? And so, the focus across government has been, the key focus has been to build a firm foundation for effective implementation of the NSP. And what I've done is I've just highlighted a few of those points. This has been done through information dissemination, virtual meetings, one-on-one meetings, and direct support for effective alignment. These have been the key tools that have been used for national departments. And the same model is being used to replicate this at a provincial level to varying degrees in different provinces, okay? And this sort of process is to kind of try and align itself with, this, what are called the APPs, and thereby embedding alignment and accountability within existing frameworks. So government has its, what it calls these performance plans. And the idea is that GBVF work should be embedded within that existing framework. So the Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation has worked with the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disability to support those various departments, government departments, in the development of specific monitoring and evaluation plans, detailing the interventions, targets, and indicators of the NSP on GBF. Now, if you know how government works, they have all of these various targets and frameworks that they use in order to, sort of arrive at their particular objectives. And so this plan has been, or the idea has been, to institutionalize the implementation of the NSP within the government departments, okay? Because there's so much, I won't go through all of it in detail, but some of these institutional processes that have been put in place, the department-specific monitoring and evaluation plans reported on a monthly basis to the presidency, the integration into the annual performance plans, inclusion of GBVF as a standard item at the Forum for South African Directors General meetings, inclusion in ministers' performance agreements, and reports to Parliamentary Portfolio Committee at regular intervals. So this is some of the reflections of this 1 year, kind of report that has been produced. I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to try and, rush through almost a lot of these observations that have been made and try to get to a more critical, assessment of this process of the NSP. As the process of rollout to provinces took place in 7 out of the 9 provinces, the following success factors emerged. So let me just reflect on this as well. Alignment of NSP on GBVF within existing structures apparently leads to quicker implementation of GBV plans. And there's visible progress in provinces where civil society is actively involved in the provincial structures. In most of these provinces, monitoring and evaluation plans are in place. And of course, there's active involvement supporting the establishment on provincial structures. Efforts to take the NSP on GBVF to district and local levels are underway, and that is to replicate this model at a district level with the NSP, and implementation being embedded within the district development model. So remember that our geographies in South Africa is that you have districts, you have metros, you have municipalities. So in order to take it right down to the sort of grassroots level, these are the various structures at which the NSP needs to actually function. The establishment of a Provincial Director General Forum by the DG in this department provides critical strategic leadership to facilitate national alignment, strengthen strategic coherence across all spheres of government, and consolidate ownership at a senior management level. And they also note that it is encouraging to note that all provinces either have a finalized provincial plan or are in the process of developing. Okay. Now, it's important to note that there are some critical aspects. I'm just going to actually rush through this because time is an issue. There's been highlights that have been raised. For example, the Department of Defense has undertaken specific processes to strengthen its response to GBV. For example, Men for Change, which launched during the 16 Days of Activism in 2020, and tackling sexual harassment within the Department of Defense. So various government departments are doing various things in order to try and institutionalize the implementation of the NSP. Okay. But of course, there are challenges, and I want to now reflect on that. Basically, there's an acknowledgement that the implementation of the NSP on GBVF requires a fundamental shift from a traditional administrative way of execution to a more dynamic, coordinated national response to the crisis of GBVF by the government of South Africa and the country as a whole. Okay. Let me just, try and reflect on what has actually happened in terms of the numbers. There is an acknowledgement that despite all the coordination efforts, only a few government departments have successfully embedded the NSP and GBVF within their operation. This points to the general lack of the sense of urgency in government in general, which needs to be addressed. More specifically, the report notes that 10 departments have compliance of 50% and above, ranging from 52% to 100%. And this is very worrying. So within the last year, only 10 departments have complied over 50%. And, we have to ask ourselves, is that good enough? And so I want to just move on. As we move into the second year of implementation, the challenge of GBVF, according to, government, remains daunting. So let me just then raise some questions, because this is how I want to conclude. It's important for us to ask these questions, noting the process of the establishment of the NSP and where it's at the moment. If the multi-sectional approach has been put into action since April of 2020, why is it that the rates of gender-based violence and femicide across the country have not reduced? What is it that is not working? Is the process of establishing the Council on GBVF delaying the process of implementing the NSP? And that question was answered to some degree by this idea that there's a consultation process happening across the country, and until that is concluded and the bill actually goes back, to Parliament in order to be finalized, we're not going to have a full implementation of the NSP. So that's where we are at regarding that. Then, are the interventions taken by the government since the presidential summit in 2018 sufficient to respond to the prevalence and incidence of GBV? The 1-year report indicates that there have been efforts made, but of course, these are not enough. And is it a question of us needing more time? And I think that regardless of the fact that the NSP was launched in 2020, we could actually have done more since then, given the seriousness of the pandemic that we faced. Speaking of pandemics, this brings us to the question, how has COVID-19 impacted on this process? Of course, the presidential summit happened in 2018, and COVID came quite soon after that in early 2020. So COVID, with all of its limitations that it's presented and challenges, it has meant that the moving forward of the NSP has been affected to a significant degree, and we have to acknowledge that. Now, the question remains, what should civil society be doing in the interim, and what is the way forward for South Africa with regards to addressing the GBV pandemic? I think that we all have a role to play in all sectors of society. And of course, the NSP as a framework, which is called an intersectional approach, is attempting to bring us all together, but it is taking time. And what we all need to do in the interim, I believe, is that we actually have to take this much more seriously. We have to take efforts on a personal level, on a kind of more broader social level, where we as individuals do something in our own spaces, and ensure that we are actually part of the solution and not just leave it up to others who are tasked with this, sort of trying to resolve this pandemic. So to conclude, I think the NSP has been an important initiative. It has really, brought us together on a common platform, but both government and the private sector and civil society need to do much more, because the incidences of GBV have really gone, and femicide have really gone out of control. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadwee. That was very interesting. Indeed, we have a long way to go in this fight against gender-based violence. Sure. I'm going to turn now quickly to the question and answer session. I'm going to look at some of the questions that have been raised in the tabs. There's some questions. I think the first one I'm going to address is to Advocate Africa. There were two questions from Mrs. Dabani. The first question is, what form of violence is it when a person is cheating or having a romantic affair while still in a relationship or married? And then the second question is, how do you draw a line between discipline and abuse when a parent or guardian wants to reprimand a minor for doing or for not doing a certain act? Can I hand over to you, Advocate Africa, to answer those two questions, please?
Thank you very much. So the first one, if I got it correctly, is what form of violence is it in if the party is cheating or in a relationship with another person whilst they are in a relationship with the complainant, just for want of a better description. So unfortunately, under those circumstances, one couldn't really say that that is a form of domestic violence, unless that particular sort of relationship is being used to undermine you as a complainant, to use to abuse you emotionally in terms of the remarks that is being made, sort of throwing it in your face all along, that you, the reason why they are with the other person is because you're good for nothing, you can't cook properly, you don't dress nicely, if you look a particular way, maybe sort of harping on the looks, and that might be, sort of a form of maybe, my apologies for not opening my camera soon. I just see that there we go. So as I was saying, that could potentially be a way in which, it could be deemed emotional abuse. But whatever you are saying it is, you are going to have to qualify specifically for that type of emotional or psychological abuse. But just the mere fact that the person is engaging in a relationship with someone else while they are in a relationship with you does not necessarily amount to emotional or psychological abuse, as was described when we discussed the legal aspects earlier. Then with regard to discipline and abuse, that's a very good question. It's a very difficult one in the sense that abuse would be excessive. Abuse would be, and certainly we don't condone the use of corporal punishment. It's definitely been banned in the schools, but, in some homes, it is still used as a form of discipline, but it's not really something, that the courts have actually condoned and that we should be encouraging or practicing. So when, abuse, if you want to differentiate between discipline and abuse would be excessive. And please, I'm using this as an example, not because I'm saying that it is okay to do the following, but let's say you give a light slap on the backside or on the shoulder or something, just to say, stop doing whatever you're doing. That could potentially be discipline, but the other form could be fisting or shoving against a wall, that would be more excessive and that could be seen as abuse. This is just to give you an example. Please, I'm by no means saying that it is okay to slap your child, because that is not something that we would encourage or condone. And certainly this would apply to children in terms of discipline and abuse. So I would say anything that is excessive, but we shouldn't really be going that route. I think the courts have before explained that is not the route that we should be going, even in when it's parents disciplining their children. And we have various views about that, and I'm not going to debate about that. But we shouldn't really be going the physical route in terms of how we are disciplining our children. And then certainly when it comes to our relationships, there shouldn't even be a question of discipline or abuse in adult relationships with each other. It's not okay for a man to hit his wife or his partner, or a woman to hit her husband or her partner, be it same sex or opposite sex relationship. That is just a no-no. That would just be abuse or assault. There would be no cause for that under any circumstances. I hope I've covered that. Dawn, I'm not sure if there's anything else that I need to cover, but that would be my contribution to those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Advocate Africa. I'm going to direct the next question to Professor Moletsani. The question was, adult facilitated girls' activism does present with messy power dynamics, especially if these adults are males. What insights can the speakers offer with regard to the involvement of boys and men who want to align with this? Professor, over to you.
Indeed, and I'm going to combine that with a question I saw in the chat, and a third one also. So the first one is about the involvement of boys in this kind of work, boys and men. Indeed, that's a good point. But today, my brief was to talk about girls' activism, which is why I as victims. And if you remember, I started by saying that the tendency to only speak of girls as victims, as only victims, is also a danger to minimizing the success of the interventions that we put in place. But also the involvement of boys is key to this kind of work. That is just not the kind of work that I personally do, but I know that there are lots of colleagues who are engaged in this kind of work. For example, the work of Kopano Ratele in the Western Cape, the work of Section 27, the work of Sonke Gender Justice. There are many lessons we can learn from the various projects that they are implementing across the country. And I know that now that Sonke Gender Justice has extended to the rest of at least the SADC region. And so that's that. The second part of the question was, I can't remember who asked it, but it was in relation to whether privileging or highlighting the victimhood of girls inadvertently sends a message to boys that it is okay to abuse because society expects them to abuse. Indeed, that wasn't the message I was trying to communicate this afternoon. The message, as I said, was I'm limited by time. I'm talking about girls today. And indeed, in a more extended conversation, we should talk about how do we communicate about this kind of work. While it is true that girls and young women are predominantly the victims of gender-based violence, it is also true that boys increasingly, especially in schools, in rural and township schools in particular, but also as we have seen and heard in the past few months, in urban and private schools, boys have been victims of gender-based violence. And how do we talk about this and in order to prevent it, to address it, but also to come up with strategies that end gender-based violence. And the fact that it's called gender-based violence means that it's not only focusing on girls as victims, but also boys as victims. Thank you. I hope that's a satisfactory answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Moletsani. That's appreciated. I think the next question I'm going to direct at you, Dr. Nadwee. It says it's interesting to note, it is interesting that none of the 6 pillars of the NSP has a focus on education in its multiple forms and sites of delivery. Can you explain this? And then the comment is, there is a distinction between information dissemination and education. The latter one would hope would bring about transformation in thinking. Could you comment on this, Dr. Nadwee?
Sure, thank you so much for the question. I think that the way in which the 6 pillars have been structured is attempting to cover a variety of areas. And so, you know, I think that this would be a question better directed to the sort of authors of the NSP directly, but in my understanding of evaluating the pillars, it seems that they have kind of assumed that education and educational initiatives would be embedded in these already. So for example, Pillar 6, which focuses on the issue of research and information systems, the assumption is that you know, one would conduct further research, one would engage in educational initiatives and disseminate information. The same with, for example, justice, safety, and protection, that you would disseminate information and you would educate people about how to, you know, sort of be safe, how to protect yourself, and what sort of legal means are available to you through the justice system in order to be able to be safe, as applies to all the others like economic power, response, care, support, and healing. So education is a very important component of the response to GBVF, because unless you have the knowledge, you're not going to be able to do very much. One of the things that many of us as activists in this area of work have been saying is that we need to have programs and courses in schools and, you know, sort of institutional educational institutions from a very early age, where children, you know, from grade 1 or whatever the sort of appropriate grade is upwards, to be exposed to the knowledge that they need to have in order to how to arm themselves, how to protect themselves, and also how to engage within the broader framework of gendered relations and gender interaction. So, you know, my understanding is that education is meant to be a central component of the NSP. It's just that maybe it hasn't been named very specifically, but that it is meant to, you know, kind of emerge as part of the work or the part of the sort of practical components of implementing the NSP. I hope that answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nadwee. I think I'm going to ask this question from all of the panelists because it was asked once in the question and answer panel, and then there was a comment on this as well. So the first question was, how can the church be of assistance in these situations? What can their role be that will add weight to their protection, to the protection order? And then the comment, in the comment section, a similar question was asked to say the church is a huge part of society and plays a major role, but has been a sleeping giant. What would you say would be the greater assistance from the church? How can the church be counted amongst those who assist? I would like to ask that we answer this from the perspective of faith-based organizations. How can faith-based organizations assist in the fight against gender-based violence? And I'm going to open it to the panel and ask if you could please, whoever would like to take this, comment on it.
Dawn, if I may, I'd like to maybe start the ball rolling. And the reason for this is something that's very close to my heart. And I think we've spoken about this ad nauseum amongst ourselves as colleagues, as well as going out there when we had to address the communities, when we do speak about gender-based violence, specifically domestic violence. So the church does, well, not the church, faith-based organizations across all religions have a very huge role to play. And we've specifically seen it, in a number of our faith-based organizations, that when there is a report of domestic violence that occurs in relationships, and it's reported either to, whichever hierarchical structure there is in that faith-based organization, very often, it's either, they do not want to get involved, or, there is some sort of counseling to try and see how the situation can be resolved. But there's never that follow-up in terms of the support to the complainant that is actually making the report and wanting some kind of assistance. And this also exacerbates the situation. So the complainant really then feels, but I can't speak out, I can't really go and report it because nobody's going to believe me, nobody's going to do anything about it, because when she tried to get help, when he tried to get help through a faith-based organization, that didn't yield any results. So I do believe that, and I think the comment is so correct, that the faith-based organizations have been sleeping giants. They're the ones that can offer the greatest support, to the complainants in the establishments. And they either turn a blind eye, as I said, or they don't provide adequate support. And latching on to the first comment, with how can faith-based organizations support protection orders, I think there should be an encouragement within the faith-based organizations that where women have applied for protection orders, that they should be aware of those, and they should be aware of the conditions of those protection orders. And we're not talking about the whole sort of establishment, as it were, but the people that are meant to support those complainants or those victims, so that they can be almost a safety net. So if there is something that goes wrong, or there's a breach of the protection order, or the perpetrator or the respondent, starts engaging with the complainant again, she has a recourse, or he has a recourse in the faith-based organization to be able to assist, because they may not always feel comfortable going directly to the police station, but there would at least be that type of recourse that they can have within that faith-based organization. And there are a number of ways in which the faith-based organization can support that particular victim. And in some cases, if it was something that had occurred, if it wasn't something that was been occurring for a long while, there may still be time, for us to rehabilitate the family and, sort of look at restoring the family situation or the relationship between the parties, depending on the type of domestic violence circumstance. But very often, when it is reported, it's almost, oh no, we'll pray about the situation, don't worry, things will get better. But there's no actual intervention from the persons within the establishment to actually take to support the complainant more, and to actually physically do something about the complainant's situation. So that would be what my comments are with regards to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Africa. Would any of the other panelists like to offer any comments on that question?
From me, except to say that it's a very challenging task to try and engage with faith-based organizations, and our experience in our project is limited to churches and traditional religious groups in the rural communities. As an example, the project that I spoke about in the dialogue and subsequent dialogues with the community indeed did invite these organizations. However, what challenged us was the conversations ended up deteriorating into going back to blaming girls and women for inviting abuse because of the way they dress, because they have left the church and are ignoring church teachings, etc. So that challenged us into thinking that actually we need to go back to the drawing board in terms of strategizing how we approach these faith-based organizations right from the start of the project, not at the consultation and dissemination stage, to work with them so that they understand the principles upon which we are basing the intervention. So far we've failed, but it's not all lost, I hope.
Thank you, Professor Moletsani. Dr. Nadwee?
Yes, so the issue of faith-based interventions is very important because, for example, the work that I've been involved in with the advanced assisted abuse, very often when a woman comes in, and let me use the example of Muslim women because that's been one demographic group that we've assisted. They'll come in and they'll sort of say that they have been granted divorce from their husbands, and this is part of the way in which the Islamic faith attempts to try to deal with the issue of divorce, and there's an entire process. So you can't just simply by vocally uttering the word divorce, give divorce to a spouse, but very often there's misunderstanding about what the religion actually is saying about how divorce works. And so a woman may say, well, she's now assuming that she's divorced and she has no recourse to any support. She may have been thrown out of the home. And then, of course, very often many of these religious bodies are there to, or one refers the wife to these bodies to go and get assistance. Quite a few of the Muslim organizations are trying to be very progressive in how they support, these women and to educate them about their rights. But of course, there are those spaces where there's a lot of patriarchy that is unfolding, and where the husband may go in to say, well, look, I've divorced this woman now, and I'm not going to support her. But we know that the legal framework and the judiciary has stepped in also to say that because we've not had a legal framework for Muslim marriages or Hindu marriages or what have you up till now, and I mean that process is currently unfolding. So the way in which matters like, for example, support for women, kind of in terms of inheritance, or well, not particularly inheritance, but just in terms of the kind of support that a woman would get if she finds herself out there and isolated within the religious framework, that has not been regulated from the kind of judiciary's perspective, and so that needs to actually be tightened up. But what I want to actually say is that we have a responsibility as a community to ensure that we educate our girls from all walks of life, from all faith-based groups, that the Constitution actually is the primary guarantee of rights in this country. And so very often, girls may be told, well, your religion says this or your religion says that, and so, you just have to listen. But the most important thing to remind our girls and women, and all South Africans, is that the Constitution guarantees their rights, and so they have access to the law to be able to seek justice. And while faith must be respected, and the religious institutions have a role to play, at the end of the day, those religious institutions must not abuse their role within the space, and religion itself should not be used to abuse people. So I think that the Constitution is very clear about this, that we all have rights, and the Constitution is heads above all the other sort of ideological frameworks that are out there. So that's just my input. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you very much, everyone. Unfortunately, I think we are out of time. There were a few other comments that were made about churches being led by, patriarchal leaders. And then also from Mrs. Khasi, who said that societal norms have to be changed because that hinders new learning, for boys and girls, in terms of gender-based violence. But I think most certainly what we can see is that we've got a lot of work ahead of us. So thank you to all of our speakers. I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Langa to do the official, vote of thanks. But from our side, it's been a thoroughly enjoyable and interesting debate that has taken place. Very awesome questions that have come out of it, but certainly made it clear that we have our work cut out for us going forward in the field of gender-based violence. So thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Langa for the closure.
We have come to the end of our webinar session. I am sure we all found the presentations to be insightful and informative. Advocate Coleman Malinga, we appreciate the professional manner in which you facilitated and guided our final webinar session. I really look forward to taking our partnership forward in 2022 and taking many other burning issues affecting the university community and the society at large. To Advocates Africa, thank you so much for unpacking domestic violence in a manner that was very, very easy to follow. You guided us through the process of applying for a protection order and what to do if a protection order is violated. It was just simple and straightforward. It was also great to know that the application forms are available in all South African languages. I like this because language can be a barrier to accessing many services sometimes. So this is really great. Thank you so much. Professor Moletsani, you delivered a thought-provoking presentation looking at girls and young women's activism in the fight against GBVF. Here at UKZN, we have many student clubs and societies advocating for various noble causes. So I hope that your presentation will motivate our students to include girl activism in their agenda for 2022. Students will do a test next year and see what is it that you've done after first semester around this issue. Dr. Nadwee, thank you so much also for giving us a very good assessment of the National Strategic Plan on GBVF. We have a long way to go in the fight against GBVF, as Advocate Coleman Malinga has said. Thank you so much for your time. I would also like to appreciate our colleague, Muhle, from Asante Solutions for the technical support on our YouTube channel and Facebook page. So if you have a friend or a loved one who might benefit from today's proceedings and they were not able to attend, please refer them to our YouTube channel for a recording of this session. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to my colleague, Shakila. Shakila handles all the behind the scenes work and she ensures that we deliver exceptional online events all the time. Shakila, please keep flying the UKZN flag high. We really appreciate your support all the time. Finally, yet most importantly, I would like to send a big thank you to all attendees for taking time off your busy schedules to join us this afternoon and for engaging in the Q&A and the chat facility. Unfortunately, we were not able to answer all the questions, but Shakira will be able to share your questions with the panel members and then they will be able to answer, and then we'll make a way to forward those answers to you directly because we have your contact details. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I wish you all a great afternoon and stay safe. Thank you. Goodbye.